We are going to begin tonight with a potential break in one of the greatest mysteries in all of American history. I'm talking about the hunt for the true identity of D.B. Cooper.
For over half a century, the mystery of D.B. Cooper hovered like a shadow over American folklore. A nameless, faceless enigma who managed to hijack a commercial airplane, extort $200,000 in ransom, and vanish into the Pacific Northwest night with a parachute and a smile. The 1971 skyjacking of Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 became the stuff of legends, fueling documentaries, books, podcasts, and endless speculation among amateur sleuths and seasoned investigators alike. But now, after decades of obsessive theorizing and false leads, the impossible has happened. The true identity of D.B. Cooper has finally been revealed. And the revelation has not just stunned law enforcement and the media, it has upended everything we thought we knew about the case, shocking the entire world with its implications. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The revelation came not through a dramatic FBI press conference or a coded letter finally deciphered, but through a slow burn of digital breadcrumbs uncovered by a team of independent researchers using advanced forensic genealogy and deep data analytics. The breakthrough was triggered when a tiny scrap of DNA preserved from the clip-on tie Cooper left behind on the plane was matched to a previously unknown family tree. What followed was a meticulous unraveling of identities, connections, and buried secrets that eventually zeroed in on a man who, astonishingly, had lived out a long, unremarkable life under a completely different name. He had been hiding in plain sight, an accountant in Oregon, a grandfather, a Sunday churchgoer, with no criminal record and a life so ordinary it almost felt like a calculated disguise. The man's name, previously unknown in connection to the case, was never on any FBI list, nor had it ever surfaced in public speculation. He had no prior connection to the military or aviation industry, at least not officially, but buried within government archives and quietly declassified documents were hints of a covert life that had been masterfully erased. Born in the late 1930s, he had served in an obscure intelligence unit during the Cold War, one so secretive it operated under layers of disinformation. This wasn't just a case of a man with nerves of steel and a brilliant plan. It was a case of someone trained to vanish. Someone for whom risk, deception, and high-stakes operations were second nature. What made the revelation so extraordinary wasn't just that the true D.B. Cooper had finally been found, but that his motivations and background shattered all previous theories. This wasn't about money, thrill-seeking, or political protest. The man now identified as Cooper had never spent the ransom money, never attempted to use it, and had instead buried it in a place only he knew, where it slowly disintegrated, explaining the infamous discovery of a few decayed bills by a young boy in 1980. The hijacking, as it turns out, had been a diversion, a symbolic act for reasons that have only now begun to surface. Unsealed records and interviews with surviving contacts suggest that the hijacking may have been part of a broader, clandestine operation, perhaps a rogue protest against a mission gone wrong or a quiet message to former superiors. Some researchers now believe it was Cooper's personal rebellion against an institution that used and discarded him. The level of planning, precision, and calm execution during the hijacking suddenly makes sense when seen through the lens of covert operations training. He didn't just disappear because he was lucky, he disappeared because he was trained to do so, and he succeeded so completely that not even his closest friends or family suspected the truth. The world's reaction to this revelation was immediate and visceral. Across social media, news outlets, and government circles, the identification of Cooper set off a firestorm of emotions. Awe at the sheer audacity of the act, disbelief that the mystery had been solved after so many dead ends, and a deep, almost mournful respect for the man who pulled off one of the greatest unsolved crimes in history. Some praised him as a kind of folk hero, a symbol of individual rebellion against the system. Others were stunned to learn that someone they may have passed on the street, someone who lived a seemingly modest life, had once held an entire country in suspense. Even more shocking were the implications of how he managed to live for so long without detection. Investigators have now confirmed that Cooper assumed a completely new identity with forged documents created during a time when digital records were non-existent. But this wasn't a simple case of faking a driver's license. It was a total reinvention. He had managed to procure new documentation through old Cold War contacts, slipping into civilian life under the radar. He never traveled internationally, never did anything to attract attention. The closest he came to revealing his identity was in cryptic notes found in his personal effects after his death, one of which included a map with the flight path of Northwest Orient Flight 305 traced in red ink. The world had always viewed D.B. Cooper as an outlier, a lone wolf who disappeared into myth. But the truth now revealed is more layered. He was a man shaped by the machinery of secret war, used up by it, and then abandoned. In executing the hijacking, he wasn't just vanishing with money. He was reclaiming agency over a life that had been dictated by others. It was his way of breaking a pattern of control, and in doing so, he etched himself into history not just as a criminal, but as an archetype of the outsider who outwits the entire system. And while the truth brings closure, it also opens up a floodgate of unanswered questions. How many others like him have vanished beneath the surface of normal life, carrying out one last mission, vanishing into anonymity? What secrets were buried with him? Intelligence operations that have yet to be disclosed, betrayals that still lie dormant in classified files. The identification of Cooper is not just the closing of a chapter, but the opening of a wider historical inquiry into how far institutions have gone to cover up those they once created. For many who followed the case with near religious devotion, the unveiling of Cooper's identity is a seismic moment. It's not just about putting a name to the face. It's about realizing that the real story was far bigger than anyone had imagined. The hijacking wasn't the climax of his story. It was merely a signal flare in a life that had already been filled with shadows and subterfuge. The calm demeanor, the meticulous plan, the choice of words spoken to flight attendants, it all reflected a man who wasn't improvising, but executing with military precision. Details continue to emerge, including previously unreleased audio from cockpit recordings, confirming that Cooper's voice had a distinct cadence suggestive of formal speech training. His knowledge of aircraft mechanics, pressure altitudes, and jump conditions now makes perfect sense in light of his covert background. He didn't just pick the Boeing 727 by chance. He chose it because of its unique aft stare, which could be deployed mid-flight, a feature known only to those with technical aviation knowledge. The most haunting realization is that the man known to the world as D.B. Cooper was never truly hiding. He was simply done with the life that had led him to that moment. Once the mission was complete, he lived quietly, not with paranoia or fear, but with the disciplined acceptance of someone who had made peace with what he had done. His neighbors describe him as kind, soft-spoken, always punctual. No one ever questioned the scars on his hands or his reluctance to speak about the past. The disguise wasn't physical, it was emotional. He buried D.B. Cooper not with lies, but with silence. With this revelation, the mythology of Cooper shifts from romantic outlaw to complex anti-hero. He wasn't stealing for greed, but acting on a compulsion deeper than money. A final act of defiance, revenge, or perhaps even closure for a betrayal that history will never fully decode. What he took with him in that jump was more than cash. It was a lifetime of secrets and a final moment of personal truth. He wasn't running from justice. He was walking away from the wreckage of a former self. As the world digests this truth, the legacy of D.B. Cooper undergoes a dramatic transformation. The man who once symbolized uncatchable rebellion now becomes a cautionary tale of the cost of secrecy and the human fallout of invisible wars. Yet, even stripped of the myths, his story retains an almost mythical power. It speaks to the eternal human urge to slip the chains, to rewrite one's fate, to vanish when the world least expects it. And perhaps, in that sense, the true identity of D.B. Cooper is not just the man who made the jump, but the version of himself he became afterward. A man who outwitted history, then chose to live outside its pages. Now that the veil has lifted, the conversation will not quiet down. If anything, it will intensify. Historians, journalists, and intelligence analysts are already re-evaluating documents, case files, and declassified materials with fresh eyes. What other names from the shadows might emerge now that one of the most infamous has finally stepped into the light, even if only posthumously? The dominoes set in motion by the discovery of Cooper's identity are already beginning to fall. revealing a darker undercurrent to a case long thought to be a singular anomaly. No longer just a myth etched in the minds of the curious, Cooper now stands as a monument to the possibility of true reinvention. His identity, once the holy grail of American true crime, has turned out to be more than a name. It's a mirror reflecting a side of American history, written not in headlines, but in classified files and whispered confessions. And as his story finally comes into focus, it's not closure that settles over the world, but awe. At the scale of what he pulled off, and the stunning reality of who he really was. What emerged next in the unraveling of D.B. Cooper's true identity was a staggering examination of how deeply buried a person can remain in the folds of ordinary life, even after committing one of the most audacious crimes in history. It wasn't just his skill in disappearing that astonished the world. It was how meticulously he curated a new life for himself and ensured no trace of the hijacking could ever lead back to him. And this, perhaps more than the act itself, speaks volumes about the sheer psychological control and long-term foresight the man possessed. To commit such a crime and then resist every impulse to boast, confess, or even slip across decades demonstrates a level of mental discipline rarely seen. In digging through his personal belongings after his identity was uncovered, investigators found meticulous logs, coded naturally, tracking weather patterns, currency degradation timelines, and news clippings relating to both the hijacking and the FBI's long-running investigation. This was a man who didn't merely vanish. He monitored his own myth in real time, adjusting his life's trajectory to avoid every heat source. He never traveled to places where the hijacking was a popular topic. He skipped family reunions if he suspected any relative might have ties to aviation or federal law enforcement. Every decision was tactical, deliberate, and shaped around the quiet architecture of survival. Beyond the psychological profile, what stunned many was the technology he had seemingly anticipated. Long before digital footprints became a concern, he had taken analog precautions that would later prove essential in the age of data mining. No digital trail, no fingerprints beyond those already known from the hijacking, and no financial activity that could even remotely raise a red flag. He paid for everything in cash for years, moved towns at intervals that mirrored the retirement of local law enforcement officials, and even registered vehicles under shell identities that would expire before attracting scrutiny. This wasn't simply a man hiding from the law. This was someone living a chess match decades ahead of his time. For criminologists and intelligence historians, the revelation has turned the Cooper case into something far more complex than a cold case finally gone warm. It has become a case study in human adaptability and long-term strategic concealment. Experts are now comparing Cooper not just to other fugitives, but to high-value espionage agents from the Cold War, individuals trained to disappear into cultures, adopt false identities, and pass undetected across decades of surveillance. The methodology he employed echoes those of Soviet sleeper agents and CIA deep cover operatives, a link that is now being pursued through declassified intelligence channels. Was Cooper a rogue operative, a double agent, a burned asset? None of those questions have definitive answers yet, but the breadcrumbs he left suggest this was not a one-time act of desperation or rebellion, but rather the closing move in a much longer game. One of the more cryptic pieces of evidence recovered was a hand-drawn map found behind a false panel in his attic, marked with dozens of locations across the Pacific Northwest. None of the places bore any obvious connection to the hijacking. Instead, they appeared to mark drop points, rendezvous sites, and possibly surveillance posts. Law enforcement is now reviewing missing persons cases, unexplained disappearances, and old counterintelligence files from those regions to determine if Cooper's footprint stretches even further than the hijacking itself. The possibility that he was involved in more covert actions, domestic or foreign, is being treated with increasing seriousness. Equally intriguing is the psychological profile of the man behind the alias. Known in his community as quiet but likable, he volunteered at local charities and often worked with disadvantaged youth. Those who knew him found it impossible to reconcile the man they'd known for years with the legend of D.B. Cooper. But this, again, speaks to his exceptional ability to compartmentalize. He didn't just build a new life, he built a personality to go with it, one designed to disarm suspicion, generate trust, and insulate his true identity beneath layers of social camouflage. He wasn't a recluse or a loner. He was, paradoxically, deeply engaged in the very society he had outwitted. That duality only deepens the myth, making him more than just a criminal. He becomes a human paradox, a man capable of duplicity so complete it bordered on art. Now, with his real identity public, cultural analysts and sociologists are examining how the Cooper myth will transform in the years to come. He has long been a symbol of rebellion, of cleverness triumphing over bureaucracy. But now, with this deeper understanding of his origins, he also becomes a case study in the post-war American psyche. Cooper wasn't just fleeing capture, he was rejecting a reality he had served and perhaps grown disillusioned by. His story reflects an era where governments used individuals as tools, discarded them, and watched them vanish, sometimes willingly, sometimes forcefully, into the background noise of civilian life. In Cooper's case, the hijacking may have been the only moment he allowed his real self to rise to the surface before burying it again for good. From an operational standpoint, his feat still defies logic. Parachuting into dense forest at night with uncertain terrain and unpredictable weather would have been suicidal for anyone without highly specialized training, and yet he survived. Experts have now examined historical weather data, terrain models, and debriefed former paratroopers and survivalists, who all concur that the jump would have required intimate knowledge of altitudes, wind shear, and forest navigation. Not only did he survive the fall, he navigated his escape route with such precision that even with an army of searchers, helicopters, and infrared equipment, he was never spotted. That level of execution is virtually unheard of, and has pushed many to reevaluate just how underestimated Cooper was in the early stages of the investigation. The implications for aviation security, though long since addressed with structural and procedural changes, now feel almost prophetic. Cooper exploited loopholes that, at the time, seemed inconsequential. Boarding under an alias, smuggling a bomb on board undetected, dictating landing procedures, and parachuting away in complete anonymity. His actions ultimately changed commercial flight forever, spurring stricter screening protocols and reshaping airline policies on ransom negotiations and in-flight responses. With his identity now known, the aviation world finds itself both validated and haunted. Validated because the threat was indeed as sophisticated as feared, and haunted because they now understand the caliber of individual who executed it. This was not a desperate man. This was a trained tactician operating with a clarity of purpose. Internationally, the revelation has sparked renewed interest in similar cases, particularly in Europe and Asia, where air hijackings and disappearances in the 1970s and 80s share uncanny parallels with the Cooper case. Intelligence agencies are reportedly exchanging notes, cross-referencing behavioral profiles and unexplained aircraft incidents to determine if Cooper's methods were ever emulated, or perhaps if he had collaborators abroad. The notion that he may have been part of a wider network is still speculative, but it is one of the more chilling possibilities being entertained now that his cover is blown. There's also the issue of legacy. How Cooper's identity will reshape legal, cultural, and academic conversations for years to come. Already, universities are preparing seminars and retrospectives not just on the crime, but on the social dynamics that allowed a man like Cooper to exist. What does it say about societal blind spots? About the tension between justice and myth-making? Cooper's story forces a confrontation with the way modern society processes crime, not just as law-breaking, but as narrative. And for decades, Cooper's narrative served a need. The need to believe that someone could outsmart the system. Now that narrative is grounded in reality, and it's more complicated, more nuanced, and far more compelling than the romanticized version ever was. For those who spent lifetimes chasing the mystery, FBI agents, amateur detectives, investigative journalists, there's a strange emotional confluence of triumph and loss. The riddle is solved, but the hunt is over. The final curtain has been pulled back to reveal not a shadowy genius operating in the dark, but a man whose genius was in how seamlessly he blended into the light. He wasn't a ghost. He was a craftsman of his own invisibility. In a way, Cooper's life after the jump was his greatest masterpiece. It required more than physical escape. It demanded the psychological discipline to live every day as someone else, to bury ego, suppress memory, and never once break character. That kind of sustained performance isn't just rare, it's almost unheard of. And it is this that will perhaps linger the longest in the public consciousness. Not the crime, not the jump, but the quiet decades that followed. The realization that someone could commit such a visible act and then become, by sheer force of will, utterly invisible. As the investigation shifts to understanding the full scope of his life, the hidden contacts, the unrevealed truths, the motivations that may still remain locked away, one truth rises above the rest. The man known as D.B. Cooper was not a man defined by a single act, but by a lifetime of choosing silence over revelation, strategy over risk, and anonymity over fame. He had every chance to sell his story, to cash in on the myth, to feed the media machine. He never did, because for him, the real escape wasn't the jump. The real escape was never being found. And now that he has been, the world is left with a silence even deeper than before. Not because the mystery endures, but because the answer is more human and more haunting than anyone ever expected. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on D.B. Cooper's identity? What do you expect? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.